Thank you to you all for being here on this cold December afternoon. I'm really delighted to be here with the Bashara Trust. And a lot of what I'll be talking about here is actually drawn from my PhD dissertation, which I'm due to submit in about a week. So obviously edits and comments are welcome, but any major, if you're about to tell me this is totally wrong, then now might not be the right time. But thank you so much. I'm really happy to share this space with you all. So today I want to offer you all, us all, a Hindu-Muslim comparative exploration of one key concept. And that key concept is the intimate presence of the divine reality to the finite world. And more specifically, I'm going to do this by way of two major philosopher-poets of the Indian subcontinent, Muhammad Iqbal and Rabindranath Tagore, who some of you may have heard of. And I'll argue that both Iqbal and Tagore, drawing on their distinctive religious traditions and inheritances, set forth the relation between the finite and the infinite, or between the world and God, as non-contrastive, by which I mean that the infinite, or God, is not a distinct item somewhere out there, or a thing among things that we might count as we might count this chair, but is the ever-creative and sustaining ground of all that there is. And I'll highlight, I hope, their distinctive ways of articulating two poles of a paradox. The infinite encircles the finite, and the finite recapitulates the infinite. And I hope that will become clearer as we go along. And I'll end by suggesting some of the implications of their cosmologies for their visions of human becoming. An undertaking that is, for both figures, firmly rooted in and always oriented to the boundless divine reality. This human creativity for both figures lies in a form of activity which is not rooted in one's own desires, but is always transparent to the divine will. So beginning first with a brief background to both figures, Muhammad Iqbal was born in 1877 in Sialkot, Punjab, today in Pakistan, and he died in 1938. And he's known today as one of the foremost Islamic modernist thinkers and as the spiritual father of the modern nation of Pakistan, although he died 9 years before the state was born. His work spans the realm of philosophy, poetry, and politics. His poetry written in Persian and Urdu, and his main philosophical work in English. And he sought, through his multidimensional work, to call Muslims to, as well as sketch the outlines of, a rejuvenated Muslim faith, one which was dynamic in nature, oriented to social change, which resisted what he called the idolatries of nationalism and other kinds of social hierarchies. Rabindranath Tagore, our other interlocutor for today, is perhaps the most famous Bengali poet of our age, whose tender verses continue to resound through the soft breezes of Bengal's villages. He was born in 1861 to a prestigious family of artists and died in 1941 at the ripe age of 80. Primarily celebrated as a poet, who became popular in the West after his securing of the Nobel Prize in Literature in 1913, he was the first non-European to do so. Tagore was also a philosophical thinker, a playwright, an author of short stories, and even a painter towards the end of his life. He authored the national anthems of India and Bangladesh, though himself an avid critic of what he termed the fetish of nationalism. An important lifelong concern of Tagore's was the relationship between the East and the West. More specifically, how the particularities of one's own spiritual and cultural tradition could be preserved while sustaining an intellectual openness and hospitality to the religious other. In this vein, he established a small school in a rural corner of Bengal in 1901, inspired by the ideals of the traditional Indian ashram, or monastery, for want of a better translation. And later in 1921, he established a larger university in the same locality, which he envisaged as an abode of peace, where, quote, the whole world might meet in a single nest. So, with this East-West synergy in mind, I want to turn first to Iqbal's vision of the God-world or infinite finite relationship, which I suggest acts as the metaphysical backdrop or canopy to Iqbal's socio-political ideas. In other words, Iqbal's reconciliation of the infinite and the finite as two complementary, coexisting and communicating realities informs his reconciliation of other binaries, such as those of religion and science, tradition and modernity, and philosophy and poetry. In his most important philosophical work, a collection of 7 lectures in English, published under the title The Reconstruction of Religious Thought in Islam, Iqbal elaborates his views on a range of topics, including the Quranic vision of the cosmos, the contributions of Islam to modern science, the nature of prophecy, and the meaning of prayer. For Iqbal, the metaphysical principle that undergirds these various strands is that the universe is fundamentally dynamic and reflects God anew at every single moment. In presenting this vision of a creatio continua, continuous creation, Iqbal is drawing on certain Quranic imageries, but also certain Western philosophical concepts and discoveries of contemporary science. By drawing on these multiple resources, Iqbal elaborates his conception of the universe as the ongoing self-disclosure of God, in which all finite entities variously embody the divine plenitude. So, commenting on the Quranic notion of the divine reality as peerless and unique, without equal, Iqbal sets forth an account of God as the, quote, great I am, or in his words, the ultimate ego, in whom the perfection of individuality, of selfhood, is transcendently complete. God alone is the true self, or individual, in the sense that God is non-dividual, i.e., God cannot be divided. Inasmuch as the universe is the, quote, self-revelation of the great I am, all created entities too partake of this individuality according to their distinctive mode of being. Drawing on the cosmological vision of the French philosopher Henri Bergson, Iqbal thus argues that the universe is structured by fine-grained gradations of egohood or selfhood, such that all things manifest individuality to the degree to which they utter I am. Each thing in the universe is, in other words, a distinct khudi or self, and khudi is a Persian and Urdu term which is a core theme in Iqbal's poetry. So that we might understand the universe as a great chain of these khudis, of these distinct individuated selves. The world is therefore not a passive or mute backdrop against which the self-unfolding of the human person takes place, for every single entity is infused with a selfhood and life of its own. This means that nothing is without purpose or dispensable in the created order. All selves are created and nurtured by God, and so all is sacred. Iqbal is, of course, drawing here on the Quranic notion of the world as a shimmering constellation of the divine signs. Indeed, Iqbal writes, referring to 2 Quranic verses, that, quote, the Muslim's duty is to reflect on these signs and not to pass by them as if he is deaf and blind. For he who does not see these signs in this life will remain blind to the realities of the life to come, end quote. In a lovely Urdu verse, Iqbal writes that every finite thing possesses its own beauty, which furnishes a glimpse of the eternal divine beauty. So this creaturely beauty, or life, or selfhood, is for Iqbal a finite reflection of the infinite divine life, and ultimately of God's longing to disclose himself to creation. A longing which is expressed in the sacred utterance of God, quote, I was a hidden treasure and I longed to be known, so I created the world. The meanings and mysteries of this phrase have been variously explored by Muslim philosophers and mystics over the ages. Exploring this divine yearning in his own poetic way, Iqbal refers to the breast of God as writhing in the pain of solitude and the creation of the world as the satisfaction of this longing. Just as God yearned to reveal God's self in and through the world, every creature too longs to unfold its inner potentialities. And so Iqbal poeticizes the first day of creation, on which all entities declared in mutual joy, quote, "I am one thing, you are another." In truth, however, this creative process is not tied to a first day. Thus, Iqbal speaks of the universe as unfinished, for the divine creative call, be, in Arabic, kun, still courses through its fibers. This conception of the divine dynamism is enfolded for Iqbal in Surah 55, verse 29 of the Quran, which articulates, quote, "the infinite reality who every moment appears in a new glory." And fleshing out this dynamism, Iqbal writes, "Nothing is more alien to the Quranic outlook than the idea that the universe is the temporal working out of a preconceived plan. The universe, according to the Quran, is liable to increase. It is a growing universe, and not an already completed product which left the hand of its maker ages ago, and is now lying stretched in space as a dead mass of matter, to which time does nothing, and consequently is nothing." Crucially, however, this dynamically incomplete character of the universe does not negate the reality of cosmic purpose and harmony. In other words, each moment of God's self-revelation is indeed new, but it's never arbitrary or random. Each entity, each self, for Iqbal, is directed towards its distinctive telos, or goal. And this directionality is for Iqbal the essence of the Quranic notion of taqdir, or destiny. Iqbal understands this destiny not as an unrelenting fate which determines the trajectories of creatures, but as their, quote, "inward reach to freely actualize their latent possibilities." So the seed that is planted in the ground yearns for its own self-unfolding and finds its fulfillment in its outgrowing of itself into the tree. As Iqbal puts it, the seed's substance, that which makes it what it is its delight in growing. The world, therefore, enjoys a mode of true otherness and freedom. And this is for Iqbal no undermining of God's majesty and power, but is paradoxically an implication of it. So Iqbal says that in giving being to the world, God freely chooses to share God's life, power, and freedom with creatures, which means that all finite things possess a measure of ontological integrity. Iqbal refers to this gift of identity to the finite as God's voluntary binding of himself to creation, a binding that is born of God's boundless freedom. Iqbal also underscores this entanglement of the finite and the infinite by highlighting that although the world is not equal to God, it is neither straightforwardly separable from God, which means that the divine-world relation can't be understood in terms of the relation of two spatially separate entities. God and the world are not related in the same way that this chair and the phone are, for instance. To treat the universe as a confronting other, in Iqbal's words, which exists per se, is to characterize God and the universe as two distinctly innumerable things, which stand over and against each other in the, quote, empty receptacle of an infinite space. It is to regard God as a big, or even the biggest, object alongside other objects, such that God's being can somehow be circumscribed in space. And here I can do no better than quote the words of my PhD supervisor, Anka Barua, to explain this subtle metaphysical point. Barua writes that theological images which position God as divine master over and above the human slave, in fact, quote, domesticate divine transcendence and lead to the perception that divine sovereignty is related to human freedom in a zero-sum game, such that highlighting the former can only entail the negation of the latter. The way through this dilemma is to remind ourselves that God and the world are not related as two distinct, innumerable powers in the sense that one entity, the Grand Master, works with another isolable entity, the novice, but in the sense that the one ineffable reality of the Creator God mystically envelops the finite being of the world. Iqbal would nod along to these words. He writes in his reconstruction of the metaphysical paradox that although the world is distinct from God, it is never isolated from him. Indeed, as we've seen, creation is paradoxically distinct from God only because it participates in God. In other words, as the transcendent and immanent ground of being, God animates and sustains the created order. The divine reality is radiantly reflected in the beauty of the world but is never exhausted by it. In a lucid summary of his metaphysical position, Iqbal declares, "The true infinite does not exclude the finite, it embraces the finite without effacing its finitude, and explains and justifies its being." So, on this notion of God as the creative, all-encompassing reality, our true environment, so to speak, we can move now to Tagore's elaboration of the infinite-finite relationship, where we find strikingly similar ideas of creatio continua, continuous creation, and the finite world as a shimmering sign of the inexhaustible infinite. In developing his cosmology, Tagore intertwines a range of Hindu scriptural ideas and theological notions. At the heart of Tagore's cosmology is the notion that the world is sung into being, where this generative sonic impulse is not a one-time burst of divine activity, but is continuously resounding through the cosmos. For Tagore, this cosmic potency of sound is crystallized in the sacred syllable Om, which is understood within some Hindu cosmologies as the primordial divine sound. The meaning of Om, Tagore tells us, is God's cosmic yes to the world, by which God utters and sustains all things in being. It is, if you like, the supreme divine call. Reflecting some verses from the Upanishads representing some of the foundational texts of Hindu philosophy, Tagore writes that God moves and yet is still. He is distant and yet near. He is within, yet also without. Thus, quote, "He does not leave out anyone. That is why he is verily Om." In characterizing the divine with the Upanishadic formulation of peace, bliss, and non-duality, Tagore notes that God's peace does not imply a lack of motion. Instead, stillness and movement are somehow entwined in God. Similarly, God's non-duality does not efface all distinctions, but synthesizes oneness and difference. All individual things find their transcendent unity in God. So this vision of a world infused with and flowing from sacred sound is elaborated in Tagore's beautiful poetic images of the world as the song or the music of the divine being. The world is woven on the warp and weft of a stream of notes, each of which reveals the sacred harmony of the finite and the infinite. Unlike other forms of art, in which the final artwork takes on an independent existence, once a painting, for instance, is completed, the painter's loving strokes are withdrawn, the streams of song that burst from the singer are never separable from the singer's life. So God's creative melody, God's song, is now separate from God. It constitutes God's perfect self-expression. This world song is renewed with each divine breath, and at every moment resounds with the divine voice. So, Tagore writes, the universe is not a mere echo, reverberating from sky to sky like a homeless wanderer the echo of an old song sung once for all in the beginning of things and then left orphaned. Rather, at every moment it comes from the heart of the master. It is breathed in his breath. As for Iqbal, for Tagore too, the music that comes from God resonates through the world with ever-fresh tunes. And in this way, the singer, the cosmic singer, perpetually generates new worldly forms. This notion of creation as God's spontaneous song points us to the Hindu idiom of Leela. Leela is a polyvalent Sanskrit term with meanings such as sport, play, charm, beauty, and others, but it refers across Hindu scripture to the notion that God is a free artist who produces and sustains the world through a spontaneous overflow of the divine bliss. In other words, the divine creativity is not necessitated by any external imperative acting upon God, for this would imply a lack or a need in God that the world somehow fulfills. Tagore's notion of the divine creativity echoes these ideas of Leela. So he writes, God's creation has not its source in any necessity. It comes from his fullness of joy. It is his love that creates. Therefore, in creation is his own revealment. As a cosmic symphony that God freely sings into the boundless spaces of the universe, creation streams out of and continually manifests the divine plenitude, or the divine abundance, to use Tagore's words. Somewhat paradoxically, Tagore presents this joyful abundance as God's renunciation or sacrifice of himself in and to the finite. And these seemingly opposed idioms of abundance and renunciation find their synthesis in love. Elaborating the nature of God's creative love, or in Bengali, prem, Tagore affirms that the plenitude of love is inseparably entwined with the austerity of sacrifice. In other words, without love, there is no true sacrifice, just as without sacrifice, there is no true love. If one's act of giving away something is impelled by fear or by need, that is no sacrifice at all. Only that which we give from the fullness of our love is a true sacrifice. Since God is the essence or true form of love, God is also the eternal sacrificer. Indeed, it is precisely because God is unconstrained by need that God is, quote, continually active and is giving himself to the world. So, in the divine life, to give is to be, so that renunciation is abundance. And this represents the paradigm for our own creative movement through the world. In other words, Tagore's maxim seems to be, I give, therefore I am. So one crucial facet of this divine love for Tagore is that God affirms the finite other in its particular otherness. And again, we find this image of God binding himself to the world. So Tagore writes, God's joyous self-bondage to creation generates creation's unfolding play, through which God goes on displaying his wondrous qualities in an unending sequence of transformations. Just as a chess player willingly submits to the rules of the game so that there may be a structured process, so too does God bind God's self to creation so that the cosmic play, or the cosmic Leela, might unfold in space and time. If a chess player were to move the pieces haphazardly, ignoring their distinctive functions and roles, there could be no play. So just as for Iqbal, God limits his will by imparting to the finite world a measure of otherness, for Tagore too, God blissfully sustains particular things in their very particularity. So he writes, quote, for power to be a power, it must act within limits. God's water must be water. His earth can never be other than earth. The law that has made them water and earth is his own law, by which he has separated the play from the player. for therein the joy of the player consists. So having outlined there the God-world relationship as expressed by Iqbal and Tagore, I want to end with a brief reflection on how this cosmic vision shapes how they understand human fulfillment. What does this all mean for us, basically, today? So to do this, I want to take as a case study their understandings of love, specifically love for God, and the embodiment of this love in human prayer. So continuing with the Tagorean thread, the theme of particularity in relationality is reiterated in Tagore's understanding of the love that obtains between the human being and the divine reality. Here, Tagore rather beautifully draws on the analogy of the bond between mother and child. Reiterating his characteristic emphasis on renunciation as in truth a form of abundance, Tagore notes that the child can only attain its mother when it renounces the safety of the womb. Only then can the joy of relational love begin. In other words, only by being born as a distinct individual can the child return to its mother in love. So too has God granted us a distinctive I, a distinctive self, without which we could not experience the bliss of relationship. The free sport of love requires two distinct players. Just as the child, quote, finds its mother when it leaves her womb, so too when we are, quote, parted from God, we become free to see his face. So the true value of the I, of the self, for Tagore, derives from its being a locus of the divine manifestation, and we are fulfilled in our particularity when we join in God's Leela of love. Tagore thus calls on God with these words: "O my Lord, in that very lone I, in that unique I, lies your unique bliss, your unique manifestation. That unique manifestation is not there in any other time and place. Lord, I will fulfill that uniqueness of mine. That you have such an absolutely independent, unique sport named I shall join you in this particular sport. I will unite here as one unites with the one." So our individuality is the created gift of the one who seeks to manifest himself therein. And each person's uniqueness lies in the way that they differentially witness to the divine. And we might highlight Tagore's assertion of the I as a unique indwelling of God with the following words of the Christian monk and theologian Thomas Merton, who said, quote, "My own individual destiny is a meeting, an encounter with God that he has destined for me alone. His glory in me will be to receive from me something which he can never receive from anyone else." And for Tagore, one crucial locus of this tender encounter between the human person and the divine is the intimacy of prayer. Tagore writes that the human person knows the bliss of direct communication with God, not only through the world of space and time, but also in the, quote, innermost solitude of consciousness, in the regions of the profound and the intense, where we can touch a world of light and love. So if our activity in the world, our everyday routine, as it were, represents the pole of movement, prayer represents the pole of stillness, wherein we recenter ourselves in and towards the divine in an intimate, loving encounter. Employing again his favourite mother-child analogy, Tagore writes that just as children keep returning to their mothers when they are at play, for without their return this play would be distressing for them, we should daily give ourselves to God in prayerful devotion. Crucially, however, this prayerful meeting with God is not meant to remain a kind of privatized or self-enclosed encounter. Indeed, Tagore highlights that if the fruits of our prayer do not flow into our everyday conduct, the act of worship is futile and is like having material goods that are solely used for performing worship in the temple but cannot be used for the needs of the world. The bliss of prayer must, in other words, spill over or become embodied in our everyday engagements, echoing God's primordial spilling over or renunciation of himself into the world. So turning then to Iqbal's vision of prayer and love, Iqbal echoes this interplay of encounter with God and outreach to the world, which he expresses in reference to shifting temporalities. In other words, prayer momentarily lifts us from the humdrum of our everyday routines into the eternal now of communion with God, where this trans-temporal moment then breathes new life and truth into our daily activities. Through prayer, Iqbal affirms, the human person realizes God as the, quote, great thou, the great you, and realizes himself as a person who is able to speak and to be spoken to. For Iqbal, this I-thou entanglement in prayer embodies the truth of Surah 40, verse 60 in the Quran, in which God invites the human person to call upon God, and God says that he will respond to this call. Prayer represents the human person's, quote, inner yearning for a response in the awful silence of the universe. And according to Iqbal, the fact that God responds to our longing affirms that God is not an impersonal or remote absolute, but a living and personal self who can be addressed in a loving encounter. In his Masnavi, the celebrated Muslim mystic Rumi, who had a deep influence on Iqbal, quite beautifully expresses this call-response structure that infuses prayer as he narrates the story of an individual who prayed for a long time without receiving an answer. This supplicant finally hears the voice of God, who asserts that the divine response is neither exterior to nor subsequent to, but is always already enfolded in the supplicant's call itself. In other words, the fact that the individual is driven to pray already reveals God's intimate presence to them. For without the prior reality of God's address, no word could ever be uttered by the human being. So God says to the worshipper, quote, your call, O God, is my call, I am here. Your supplication is my message, dear one, and all your striving to come close to me is but a sign that I draw you to me. Your loving quest and pain are signs of my grace. In each, O God, are 100, here's my face, God's face. And this description of the divine face as that which God offers to the human supplicant highlights the centrality of prayer as a locus of witnessing God. Prayer combines both voice and vision as an intimate encounter in which the human person both calls upon and sees God. And Iqbal is echoing here the assertion of the hadith, or statement by the Prophet, that prayer is the ascension of the believer, in suggesting that in the encounter of prayer, the supplicant shares in the Prophet's own heavenly witnessing of the divine. So, just as the Prophet rose bodily to witness the divine, so too for Iqbal does prayer reorient our spiritual gaze towards the divine face, which is visible, as the Quran tells us, wheresoever you turn. From their distinctive scriptural horizons, Iqbal and Tagore understand the cosmos as teeming with the restless yearning of the human being to discern their rootedness in the divine unity. As wayfaring humans imitate their divine template, they strive to embody the relational truth of the cosmos, where to be is to be related. Prayer provides one such sight which embodies this relationality, through which we recapitulate, reflect, and respond to God's continuous giving of himself to creation. To use Tagore's idiom, if the world is enfolded by God's music, prayer is the glue that holds together its notes. And while these resonances between Iqbal and Tagore may seem quite remarkable, and remarkable they indeed are, they reflect some long-range thematic overlaps across the universes of Hindu devotion and Islamic mysticism or Sufism. But for now, I think I'll leave it there. Thank you for your attention.